This happened when I was a kid. I was in the 5th grade and my friend, let's call him Ethan, invited me over to his place. He lived right by the ocean, and if you walked through the forest for half a mile, you'd reach a nice beach with a diving board. When I got to his house, we hung out, played video games, and talked. You know, typical kid stuff. Then we decided to go to the beach. It wasn't too far away and we knew we could get back in time for dinner, so we set off. To make the trip more adventurous, we decided to bushwhack our own path. After walking a couple of minutes, we hit a tall fence. "Crap," Ethan exclaimed. "Well, I guess we'll have to go back." Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something. The fence went about 8 meters long and then stopped. My jaw dropped. There was a house. It was an old cabin with boarded-up windows. The planks were falling off, and you could see the old insulation underneath. It was gray in color and had flecks of blue paint. The fence led up to the side of the house, stopped, and then continued on the other side. What scared me the most was that there was no road. I mean, not even a clearing to get to the road. You'd have to walk 20 minutes. "Kevin, come on!" Ethan yelled from behind me. "Look at this!" I shouted back. Ethan walked up to me and his jaw dropped. There was no door, just a frame, and peering through the frame we could see that there was a back door, also with no frame. All we had to do was walk through the house, then we could get to the beach. I looked at Ethan. "Should we do it?" I asked him. He shrugged. "I don't see why not," he responded. Inside the house was dark, despite the sunlight pouring in through the door. We advanced slowly through the house, and Ethan pointed to the door. As we reached the door, I peered up the stairs. I grabbed Ethan and shoved him out the door. "What was it?" he said as soon as we got away. My whole body shook. I must be going mad, I thought to myself. Eventually, I explained it to him. As we reached the door, I wanted to take one last look at the house. I glanced up the stairs and I saw the shadowy outline of a person. All I could see were eyes staring back at me and a crooked grin. Ethan and I took another route back home, and we told Ethan's mom. She laughed at us and said she'd been that way many times and there was no house. And we were angry because she didn't believe us, so we got out our cameras and went back the next day. When we got there was no house. It was just gone. No clearing, nothing. To this day, Ethan and I still wonder what it was. Was that man just a homeless person, or maybe he was something much, much worse? I suggested to Ethan a theory that scares me to this day. I had been reading about Russian folklore, and a page caught my attention. It was a story about a witch named Baba Yaga who had a moving house. She would eat naughty children, and parents used to use it to scare children. Was this a witch? I guess we'll never know for sure. I was in my early teenage years during this time. My family and I went on vacation in a village which had a forest rumored to be haunted. There was a cemetery in the forest. It was a little far away from the village, near a lake. We weren't actually supposed to go to that forest, but my cousins thought it would be fun to play hide and seek at night. We were given some rules. We weren't allowed to take our phones or flashlights with us. As planned, we all met in front of our farmhouse at midnight. Me and my younger sister, who was 7 years old at that time, were the youngest out of everyone. So my older cousin decided to help us hide. He was 22 at that time, and he wanted to make sure we didn't get lost. After we chose who was going to be the seeker, we parted ways, trying to find the best hiding spot. My older cousin just wanted to win, so he took us to the cemetery. He said, "She'll obviously be too afraid to enter the cemetery. I think this will be a best hiding spot for us." Although my younger sister kept telling us not to go there, we shut her off, telling her she was just a kid and would make us get caught. To this day, we wish we would have listened to her. It was getting darker. It was almost 2 a.m. Then all of a sudden, the cemetery lights went out. My sister's hand tightened around my hand. My cousin was obviously scared too. We could only hear the sound of wind and stray dogs barking at the backside of the cemetery. But then, we heard digging noises. I still remember that horrifying sound. At a distance, we could see an old man with ruffled hair and dirty clothes, digging a grave with his bare hands. He was making hissing noises while he dug. All of us stood there frozen. We didn't know if we should scream or run away. My cousin held our hands and started to slowly lead us to the entrance, trying not to make any noise. He whispered, "We have to get out of here." My sister was almost on the verge of crying. But to ruin everything, I stepped on a broken branch, making a loud noise. The stranger shot up his head toward our direction, and his lips curved in a creepy smile. "Run!" my cousin yelled, quickly picking up my sister and running away as I followed closely behind them. Thankfully, the man was weak and couldn't run any faster. He stopped at the middle of the cemetery, staring at us with his hazel eyes. A few days later, we found out that the man had been caught by the police. He was a criminal who dug up dead bodies, stored drugs in them, and sent them off to other nations to sell drugs. He was caught once, but successfully escaped. If he wasn't so old and weak, I'm afraid that we might have ended up being a couple of dead bodies too.
Hi, my name is Alyssa, and I'm 15. A few months ago, something strange happened to me. To this day, I can't explain exactly what happened. I was relaxing at my house, doing some schoolwork on my laptop. Being home alone never bothered me until then. After about 2 hours of being alone, I decided to go get some ice cream from the freezer. As I headed back with ice cream to my room, I heard someone bang on the front door. I never answer the doors, and I always make sure they're locked when my parents leave. I decided it was the mailman, and that he would set the package down and leave. Then I heard the bang again, but louder. I was confused, so I went to my dad's office since it had a window facing the front porch. The second I grabbed the door handle of his office, my parents' bedroom door slammed shut right next to me. I screamed. Our air conditioning was broken at the time, so there was no way it could have been the air. I looked at the door, ran to the other side of the house, and called my mom to see if she was expecting anyone over. "No, Alyssa," she said. And those 2 words made my heart beat faster than it ever has. My phone disconnected, and I started hearing footsteps coming towards me from down the hallway. I ran and hid behind a door in our living room. I knew I'd be out of sight, since I used to hide there as a child. I called my close friend Emily, who always knew how to calm me down in crazy situations. She told me to go and lock myself in my room. As she was talking, I started to hear doors open and slam shut along with footsteps, and the voice of a little girl saying, "I'm going to find you," over and over. I started crying, and when the noise stopped, I ran to my bedroom door. When I grabbed the handle and was about to go in, I heard it again. The little girl was in my room and said, "Come here, Alyssa. I want to play. Come here." I ran to the guest bathroom and locked myself in. I started to hear knocking on the bathroom door and the voice, "Don't you want to play, Alyssa? We could have a lot of fun." I started screaming back, "Hell no, just leave me alone." She started laughing. The knocking and laughter grew louder and louder, and then it started sounding like that thing, started to walk away, still laughing and knocking. Then I couldn't hear it anymore. My grandpa came into the house yelling, "Alyssa, it's Grandpa. You can come out, you're safe." I ran as fast as I could to my grandpa. Later on, I found out that after my phone cut out on my mom, she sent my grandpa to check on me. Once I told my grandpa that a little girl had gotten into the house, we went around the house searching for her, but we never found anything. All the windows and the doors were locked. The garage was closed up tight, and nothing was broken into. I hate being home alone now, and being in my room, but I've learned to deal. When I was about 9 years old, I was in my swimsuit, ready to go to swimming lessons. My brother and I had made a pillow fort, and it was still there from the night before. I had crawled underneath the coffee table, where a blanket went over it, blocking out the outside world. I have no idea why I stuck my foot outside of the blanket, but I did. A dark black sock crawled creepily towards my foot and slowly slid over it. The sock was cold, and I felt odd. I recognized the sock. It looked just like the one my mom had. I called out my mom's name and my brother's name, but there was no response, only silence. I walked to the window, but when I looked out, there was nothing out of the ordinary. I saw my cat staring at me with a weird look on her face. Then, I was horrified when I heard the shower running upstairs. My mom was still in the shower, and my dad was at work. I ran up the stairs to find my brother spinning on the chair in my parents' room. I asked him if he went downstairs, and he told me he had nothing to do with the situation. I told my mom what had happened, but she didn't believe me. She said that I was probably hallucinating and that it was just the cat. But I know what I saw, and the look on my cat's face is still fresh in my memory. I'm 24, and this happened 5 years ago when I was 19. I was conducting an online transaction on a site called Alks, which is similar to Craigslist. It's an online app where you can see items being sold by random strangers, and all you have to do is make a call and meet up. I was looking for a cheap sweater for my trip to Japan the following week. After several minutes of scrolling, I came across an ad with exactly what I was looking for. A Korean-style female fur sweater for just 300 pesos, about $6. It was perfect. I had issue with it. The meetup point was at the LRT train station at 8 p.m. because the seller was too busy at work. I decided, what the heck? It's a public place anyway. I called the owner and we had a quick convo. He sounded like a strict guy, but I asked him when we could meet up. He responded, "Tonight at 8 p.m. sharp." I said sure. But this recklessness of mine is what I regret the most. I arrived at the meeting place at 7:58 p.m. It was really empty, and I was sure I was the only person in the station. It was a cold night in November, and I eagerly awaited warming myself with my coat. Honestly, I'm the kind of girl who's comfortable wearing a sweater even when it's hot. I was sitting on a bench when the clock ticked 8 o'clock, when suddenly someone covered half of my face with a scarf with a really strange scent. I fell unconscious. As I woke up, I found myself in a van with 4 guys, my wrists handcuffed behind my back. I asked the man what they wanted and to please let me go. Tears began to fall from my eyes. But then, one of the guys touched my face and said, "It's our first time ever tasting a beautiful girl like you." I kept on crying and shouted, "Please, I want to go home, please." The guy next to me choked me, shouting that I needed to shut up. I tried to resist, but my eyes started to roll back in my head. He stopped, but it was taking a long time for me to catch my breath. I looked out the window and saw a checkpoint lane. For the first time in my life, I was so glad that the authorities had permission to check the van. But the guy next to me reached for a gun, a really big gun. Knowing this was my only chance, I found the strength to shout and cried out, "Officer, please help! They have a gun!" The 2 officers immediately grabbed their guns, one shooting at the tires, the other aiming for the man next to me. The officer shot him in the head. I never thought I'd witness such a thing in my life. One of the officers carried me out of the van, and I passed out moments later. I woke up the next day in a hospital bed. My parents were there, crying and asking me what happened. I told them the truth, that I was buying a sweater online. But I suddenly snapped. I cried and cried, saying, "Please help, please help." Since then, I've had to go to a psychiatrist to recover from mental instability and anxiety, and it should go without saying, but I never ever want to buy anything online, ever again.
When I was 7 or 8 years old, my parents used to take me to this beach cafe in our town. It had a pool and the cafe was right next to the beach. The family that owned the cafe were my family's close friends, so I spent a lot of my childhood there. The best part about the beach is that when you passed the cafe and the playground, there was a lot of sand and a net for volleyball. As kids, my friends and I would always play there. One ordinary summer night, there was quite a few of us playing in the sand, making castles and doing other things. All of a sudden, I heard a noise behind me in the bushes, right where the sand ended. I should mention that there were woods around the whole place, but it wasn't deep or anything. I was a brave kid, so I just brushed it off as being a cat or animal of some sort, and continued to play. However, when I looked up at my friends who were now quiet and staying still, I got the chills. I noticed that all of their eyes had widened. They were staring at me, or rather at whatever was behind me. The shock kicked in, and I felt like I was going to faint. I started shaking. I didn't even want to turn around. But when I felt something cold on the back of my neck, that was the last straw. I started running full speed towards the cafe filled with people, and my friends immediately followed behind me. There were 6 children crying and screaming at the top of our lungs. I remember finally clinging to my mom and crying in her arms. Soon after, the sound of sirens followed by police cars parked in front filled the air. When the adults talked to the police, my friends and I were confused. I still didn't know what was behind me, so I asked my oldest friend in the group, who was 10 years old and talking to his dad. It turns out there was this crazy old guy who robbed a lady and stabbed her to death not so far away from here. My friends told me he appeared behind me smiling like a sick clown. He was holding a knife and pressing it against the back of my neck. That must have been the cold thing I felt. From then on, I never stayed far away from the cafe when the sun went down. And thankfully, they caught the guy.
This happened a little over 20 years ago. I was 10 years old and my sister was 6. We grew up in a small town, raised only by our hardworking mother. It started when school was nearly finished for the year. The nights were late because my sister was up all night crying about a witch. Anyway, my mother started receiving odd calls once in a while at work.
I need one of your children.
Mom figures it was some stupid prank and ignored it. But then she started receiving calls daily. Eventually, she was receiving a call most nights at our home. She reported it to the police, and they said whoever was calling was using random payphones. There wasn't much they could do about it. So she had both her work and home number changed. One night around 10 or so, there was a frantic knock on her door. Mom looked out through the window and saw a lady with long hair in her 60s. Not knowing her, Mom went near the locked door and asked what she wanted. The lady asked if she could come inside because she was in a car accident. Mom said she would call the police for her and told her to wait outside. There was a pause.
No, don't call the cops.
Mom thought this was strange and started walking to the phone. Immediately again, a banging on the door. Mom ran to the phone and looked out the window to see the lady staring at her. She coldly said,
Dorothy Margaret, I want one of your children. Dorothy Margaret, I want one of your children.
She kept repeating it until Mom noticed flashing lights of police approaching, and she left. The police searched everywhere and kept a car outside each night for a week. Nothing. A few weeks later, summer finally started and my sister wasn't having the nightmares anymore about the witch. We were at one of my baseball games, and my mother was talking to a teacher at my sister's school and telling her what happened. The teacher said,
"Oh, it sounds like your stepmother."
Mom looked back confused and said she doesn't have a stepmother. The teacher's face turned white. A while ago, a lady in her 60s would come watch the children play at lunch. She said she was my mother's stepmom and liked to watch my sister at lunch. She reported it again to the police, and they checked camera footage. Sure enough, on a faraway park bench, there was an old lady most lunchtimes. They noticed she was always coming from the woods, so the police did a search and found an old shanty shack type of place. It had old blankets and a fire pit, and it had pictures she had drawn of us. That was the last time we ever heard of her. When summer was ending, my sister started having the nightmares of the witch again. Mom asked why she was getting scared again, and she said,
"Because she comes to school and watches us."
The witch was the old lady.
I met a terrible creep at a McDonald's restaurant. I was running errands with my husband one day when I was 6 months pregnant. The day started out normal as we took the subway together. All of a sudden, I felt nauseous and I could feel that I had to vomit immediately. I quickly gave my bag to my husband and told him I had to run to the nearest bathroom. I bolted away at the next stop as I could not hold it in any longer. As I exited the underground, I ran into the nearest restaurant, a McDonald's. I hurried to the bathroom, where I passed a middle-aged man who was standing at the entrance of the bathroom. I paid no attention and pushed past him to get in. As I finally arrived to the bathroom, I immediately started puking. I never felt so sick my entire life. That's when the door handle of the bathroom started moving. I quickly pushed the door to keep it closed and yelled that it was busy, but the person on the other side pushed back. As that person managed to push harder, I saw the guy that was at the entrance. He had curly hair. I freaked out and slammed the door shut and started yelling for help. The man was insistent and kept trying to get in. I started puking again, so I was left with trying to hold the door with my foot as he kept banging it harder and harder. I continued yelling in the direction of the window of the stall as I heard people saying that there was a girl who needed help. Suddenly, the guy stopped banging the door and everything got quiet. I tried to calm myself down while still holding the door shut just in case. Then, I saw curly hair and a hand trying to get me from under the door, which had a pretty large gap. I started screaming again as I started kicking his face. At this point, I was desperate. I had no phone, no bag, and my husband was probably roaming the city looking for me. Then, I heard a man yell, and the creep suddenly getting away quickly. I kept the door shut when I heard a male voice telling me to come out and that it was okay. I reluctantly opened the door to find the manager of the McDonald's confused and shocked. I told him what happened and he called the police. With all the commotion, my husband finally found me. When the police arrived, I gave the police a description, but they never found the guy.
It was the summer before 9th grade. I was at my friend's family pool party, and there were tons of people there. At one point, while my friend, let's call her Lily, went to get some sodas for us, a man came up to me. I didn't recognize him, but since it was my friend's party, it made sense for me to not know everyone there. He smiled at me. He looked as though he hadn't shaved in days, and his eyes never looked quite directly at me. I stepped backwards, feeling uncomfortable.
"Hello,"
he said. Hi, I replied.
"What's your name?"
he asked. I supposed that a first name wouldn't hurt, seeing as we were surrounded by tons of people in my friend's backyard. I'm Carly, I said. What's yours?
"Rick,"
he replied smoothly.
"Are you having fun with Lily?"
Some of my discomfort eased.
"I'm her parents' friend,"
he continued, stepping closer to my face. His eyes weren't focused, and his breath smelled like alcohol, even though it was early in the day. I grew even more uncomfortable and stepped away, waving goodbye awkwardly. When I turned around, he was gone. I told Lily about this, and she mentioned it to her parents. Her parents said that they didn't know Rick, which kind of freaked me out. But they told me that it could have been one of their friends who brought him over. So I shrugged it off and assumed everything was fine. After the party ended, Lily and I were having a sleepover at her house. Her parents had gone over to visit her elder sister to take some leftovers to her, since she had not been feeling well and couldn't attend the party. So we were home alone with her elder brother. Lily and I were playing a game in her bedroom when her dad called her. He asked her to please go and turn off the pool lights, since he had forgotten. Lily agreed, and we stepped outside into the backyard. I waited on the back porch, reading a text from another friend, while she went to turn off the lights. Once she was finished, we stepped back inside, locking the door, and went back upstairs to continue playing our game. At one point, Lily asked me to make sure the curtains were closed properly, and when I did, I happened to look outside, and I noticed that all the pool lights were on again. "Lily?" I asked, getting a strange feeling. "You turned off the pool lights, right?" "Yeah, I did," she replied, coming to look. Now there was a figure swimming laps in the pool, even though we couldn't see his face. It's probably just Cody," Lily replied, speaking of her brother. "Come on, let's go scare him." We walked down to the pool and slid open the back door. Waiting behind the bushes, we could see the top of his head bobbing in the water. We were going to jump out and scare him at any moment. But then I looked up at one of the windows of the house. The curtains were open. Suddenly, I saw the face of Cody illuminated as he turned on his bedroom lights. I grasped Lily's arm, and we both knew the person in the pool was not, in fact, Cody. We hadn't brought our phones with us in case we would get wet, and if we ran back around, there was a chance the stranger could see us before we got back to the house. We tried to wave to Cody, but he couldn't see us. Suddenly, splashing in the pool stopped. My heart dropped and I could hear each of my panicked heartbeats. A hand suddenly gripped my arm and flung me forward, and I screamed, and Lily did as well. I looked up, and there was Rick. His facial expression I will never forget. I've never seen someone with such a creepy smile. I yelled, and soon my mouth was filled with water as he chucked me in the pool, and he actually held me underwater. I choked for breath and realized he had grabbed Lily's arm as well, although she wasn't in the water. He was strong and clearly ill. He yelled, "Time to swim!" Somehow Lily managed to kick him in the face hard enough to run away, slamming the door behind her. He continued to hold me, laughing as I flailed for breath. Just as I felt I was about to die, police sirens were heard in the surface. He picked me up and threw me on the ground, breaking my arm. He ran away. The police came and questioned me, but he was never found. I will never forget that moment. I thought I was truly going to die. Nor will I forget those creepy, unfocused eyes. From then on, I've been terrified to be outside at night, especially in a pool.
I was driving home from work one night around 9 p.m. midweek, so the roads were quiet. As I was driving downhill, I heard a sound that was like a jet engine roaring behind me. The next thing I know, a car goes flying past me going twice the speed limit. It looked like a fairly old and crappy car, and the car started to get the speed wobbles. Then one of the tires came flying off and rolled at high speeds downhill while the car spun out and crashed. I stopped my car to make sure whoever was inside was okay. A guy got out of the car and looked over at me and then started moving extremely quickly towards me. I don't know why, but I hit my internal locks on the car, which was fortunate, because no more than 2 seconds later, the guy started grabbing at the driver's side door and smashing on my windscreen with his fists trying to get in. I'll never forget the look he had in his eyes. I put my foot down on the accelerator and drove off back home. I decided to swap cars once I got home and drove back to see what was going on. I saw 2 fire trucks and about 4 police close to where the incident happened. When I got back to the crash site, the guy was no longer there, so I decided to head home. The next day at work, I was online and bored reading the news when I saw an article that shocked me. The article was about a guy who had been in a police chase for 1 hour, and the police stopped chasing him because it was becoming too dangerous. Turns out the guy was high on meth, had stolen a car an hour's drive away, and had been in a hot pursuit since. After crashing the car, the guy apparently crossed to the other side of the road and hailed the first car that appeared, which was a taxi. He got into the taxi and stole it. In the process, he pushed the driver out of the driver's side door, and the driver got stuck and dragged at speeds. The driver died from the incident. I called the police and had a detective assigned to me. He fingerprint checked my car and got a statement. I had to testify in the Supreme Court as a key witness in a murder trial. The guy got 30 years, and they told me that my testimony was one of the main factors in convicting him. I often think back to that night and wonder if I hadn't locked my doors, would I have been the one who got murdered?
My name is Milo. I'm 14 years old, but this happened about a year ago. One day, I was having a sleepover with my 2 best friends, Ben and Michael, to celebrate Ben's birthday. Ben wanted to go camping and have a bonfire, so we all set up our tents for a fun night. When we set everything up, we talked about the usual teenage boy stuff, sports, cars, and girls. As the night progressed, Ben began to tell us about a man from our town who was on the run from the police. He said that the man lurked around in the darkness and kidnapped teenage boys. He grabs you by the legs and drags you through the forest while looking for more kids to prey on, Ben said. We all burst out with laughter at how ridiculous it sounded. Nothing like that would ever happen in our town, right? At least, that's what we thought. We all started to feel sleepy and decided to call it a night. During the middle of the night, I got out of my tent to use the bathroom on one of the trees nearby. But when I was done, I looked back to see a man warming his hands on our fire, and 3 small, dark figures hid behind him, each looking like a starved child. I screamed in fear, waking my friends who freaked out when they saw him. We sprinted out of the forest to warn people about the man, but nobody in town believed us. When it was light outside the next morning, we went back to the forest to collect our gear and go home. Everything was there, but a note was left on the ground. It read, "Grabs you by the legs and drags you," with a smiley face drawn at the end. We alerted the police and never went back to that forest again.
About 10 years ago when I was 12, I would always go into the nearby woods with my friends for most of the day. One night, we left pretty late. Usually I got home before dark, but today, I knew I wouldn't make it back, and I already knew my parents would be mad at me. We were walking in a group for a few blocks. Then a couple of my friends split from us to go to their house. I started to notice that a van kept driving past us. I didn't think anything of it. And then my last friend split to go to her house. I had about 5 to 10 minutes left until mine. Then I see that van again, and it pulled up right beside me and stopped. The driver rolled down the front window. Then she told me that she can't find her son and she's been looking all evening. And she asked me if I seen him. I looked and I said no. Then she asked me if I wanted to get in her van to help find him. I said no again, and I looked forward. Then she asked me, am I sure? I didn't answer and I started to walk faster. Then all of a sudden, there was some guy in her back seat that said, let's just fucking snatch her. I looked at the van for a split second as the woman looked in the back seat and she sped up to park on the side of the street. I started running through yards. I heard the doors open and shut on the van, but I didn't look back until I got home. Nobody followed me. I told my parents and we called the cops. I never missed curfew after that.
I'm scared of the dark, and I have a good reason for it. You might be thinking, so? Almost everyone is scared of the dark because something happened to them. Well, that is true for me too. Here's my story. About 2 years ago, I ran away from home. I don't know just what I was thinking at the time, but I left with no food, no water, no belongings, and no coat. It was a very rainy day, and I sensed that I should either find shelter or I'd be soaking wet. So I decided to walk to my school and stay there for a few hours to dry off, as I was already wet and cold on a rainy day. As I arrived, I laid down my head and quickly fell asleep. And when I woke up, it was pitch black outside, and I could barely make out anything. I didn't have a watch or anything that tells the time, so I assumed it was midnight. At least it stopped raining, I thought. I decided to just go back home, as I wasn't far and I was very hungry that time. As I got up, I stopped. There was something in front of me, under a streetlight, about 50 yards away. It was a man about 6 feet tall, and he was wearing a black coat with a hoodie over his face, so I couldn't see his face. At first, I thought it was my dad who had come to look for me, so I felt relief. But I didn't want to get into trouble, so I hid in a bush nearby and peeked out. The man was standing there and looked around for what it seemed like a half an hour. Then, under the light of the streetlight, he pulled something out of his pocket. I couldn't make it out at first, but then I realized it was a kitchen knife. Then he started to run toward the bushes. No, towards me. Exactly. I grew frightened and sprinted out of the bushes like an arrow. He already knew I was there. I didn't stop running until I got home without ever looking back. So I survived. But to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I didn't run on that day. Or worse, what would have happened if I didn't wake up at the school? I developed my fear of the dark from this incident. It's so bad that now I have to sleep with a nightlight or the hallway light occasionally, because I'm afraid that the man whom I saw will kill me or kidnap me someday if I don't turn the light on. This fact happened when I was 15 years old, beginning of last year, 2018, when I finally got to sophomore year here in Brazil. It was an ordinary Friday night. Suddenly, I felt a little bit hungry, so I decided to put on some clothes and go to the snack bar. It was barely 10 minutes from my house. I usually pass through the alley to go to the snack bar, but that time, everything was so creepy in there. When I was halfway there, it was dark, empty, abnormally cold and gloomy. I felt slightly intimidated, but there was nothing there that could really harm me. So I decided to just go through that alley. Then I thought, nothing's gonna happen. I kept going until I suddenly heard something weird on the other side of the alley. There was a man in there, staring at the walls in hunchback stance, grunting weirdly. I found that incredibly creepy, but I was nearly at the snack bar, so all I needed was just to get out of that alley. Walk 1 minute more and I finally would get there, instead of making it all the way home with empty hands. Thus, I decided to ignore him and pass through after all. I finally passed through him. He turned to me and stared at me with a creepy smile, which made me walk a little bit faster, trying to avoid him. Then, suddenly, I heard a grunt and quick steps behind me. When I looked back, it was him. We were barely 2 feet away from each other. He had a kitchen knife in his right hand and jumped on me with amazing speed and tried to stab me. I managed to grab both of his arms before he could get me. However, since he was charging at me, he still had more energy to push me back and force me against a wall. I was terrified with all of that. I knew I would die if I didn't fight back. Back then, I was already trained in some martial arts to defend myself, but that I thought I'd never need to use that skill to defend my life until now. So, in a sudden burst of adrenaline, I managed to twist the wrist which he was holding the knife, kicking his stomach and punching him mercilessly in the face several times. In the end, his face was bleeding so much, but his body was ignoring the pain of the blows in his body and only focusing on killing me. Finally, I used a training that I took before to twist both of his wrists and elbows harshly at the same time, forced in 2 different directions, and kicked the backside of his leg, putting him to the ground until ultimately he could drop the knife. It wasn't easy because he was struggling and punching my back and somehow trying to jump on me. But since I had his arm under my grasp, he couldn't do much without breaking himself. I slammed his head in the concrete ground, stunning him, then kept striking his face desperately while kneeling over his arm so he wouldn't be able to react or reach his knife again. Then finally, he was out cold, bleeding a lot. My knuckles were full of blood and hurt. So I got up, took his knife, throwing it far away from there, and ran away from him. I finally got to the snack bar, washed my hands in there, and did everything I had to do before going back home. But obviously, I didn't take the same path as I did before. But there were things that got much creepier. That was at the entrance of my apartment, where I heard screams coming from the other side of the street. It was the same crazy man. Now, seeming like he was possessed by a demon, and he was slamming his head on the iron door of my building's entrance. His face was horribly deformed and scarred from our fight. That freaked me out completely. My parents were on a trip, and the watchman of our building was on vacation. I wasn't going to fight that man again, so I decided to rush to my girlfriend's house. When I got there, she was home alone. She looked worried because I was looking pale, and there were still some marks of the man's blood on my clothes. I explained everything to her, and we called the police to come by my building. And when they arrived, the man was still in the entrance trying to force the doors unsuccessfully. When he saw the police, he attacked them, but got quickly dominated by the cops. They explained that he was probably a crazy psycho in the streets looking for prey to rape, kill, or do anything he wanted to the person. So they sent him to a high-security mental asylum for criminals far away from my house. I feel so lucky that I survived that day, and I'm hoping that I will never see that man again.
When I was 10 or 11, my cousin and aunt visited us. We had fun throughout the day, and my aunt and cousin decided to sleep at my other aunt's house before leaving early in the morning. After such a fun day, I insisted upon sleeping at my aunt's house too, so I could spend more time with everyone. Later that night, we all fell asleep in the guest room, the only room that was available for us. I woke up suddenly at 5 a.m. I heard my mom and other aunt talking, so I was definitely awake. I saw that my cousin and aunt's things weren't there anymore, so I assumed they'd already left. I was about to fall back asleep. I looked at my left and saw someone sleeping beside me. I was about to hug her, thinking it was my 21-year-old girl cousin. But then I saw her face. She wasn't my cousin at all. She was someone I didn't know. But she looked about the age of my cousin. She wore pajamas and a black shirt, and all I could do was stare at her. She started doing strange things, like stretching her legs up and down and just focusing on the ceiling. It was all so odd. But feeling tired, I eventually drifted off to sleep like nothing had happened. I woke up at 8 a.m., looking at my left, and she was gone. I told everything to my mom and every family member in the house, but no one knew what I had experienced or who the girl was. My dad told me that my third eye was starting to see more, but I didn't really believe that. I'm turning 13 now, and that experience still remains a mystery to me. It never happened to me again, and hopefully it won't.
Hi, my name is Adil, and this is a true story. The police have finished this case, and the man is in prison now. I was 14 at the time this took place. I was in a school and sitting in a history lesson that was so boring. My friend Noel, who was sitting opposite me, said I could come over on Saturday, as his parents were not going to be there because they were going on a weekend away. That meant we could stay up as long as we wanted. This was not uncommon, as we both invited each other to stay at one another's house, and I thought we were going to have a great time. Saturday came, and I was so ready. I packed my essentials like my toothbrush, my new game, and my pepper spray. My parents always made me carry it, and I didn't mind because it made me feel safe too. I went on my way, and 30 minutes later, after walking, arrived to Noel's house. As he opened the door, he looked a little tense and shifty. I walked in and locked the door after me, to which he became even more anxious. I asked him if everything was all right, and he said it was. Not trying to put a down on the evening, I asked him if we could play the new game I bought. He wasn't really interested, but said yes anyway. After 30 minutes of watching him not playing and just holding the controller in his hand, I switched off the TV and asked him what was going on. To which he replied, "I need your help." I asked him what he needed my help for. He told me that this man who added him on Facebook was actually stalking him in real life, and as to how he wanted to meet Noel. He warned him that if he told his parents, he would kill them. So Noel, being the stupid idiot, he told him to come at 8 p.m., 5 minutes from now. He was scared, so he asked me to come to this meeting to get rid of him, and that if he had told me at school, I never would have agreed to come. He was right. I felt betrayed that he brought me here under false pretenses. I was also angry at his stupidity of him giving his address away as well. However, I had no time to argue. I was just glad he told me about this guy. I grabbed my pepper spray and just sat there on the couch. The doorbell rang at 8 p.m. I just sat there hoping he would leave after a little bit. However, then I started to hear scratching and realized he was breaking in with some sort of tool. I quickly ran into the kitchen with Noel, and we heard the door lock get broken, and someone kicked the door in. The lights were on, and we were hiding behind the large fridge. The man, in a deep voice, shouted, "Noel!" We didn't reply, and then he shouted, "Noel, where the heck are you? I'm going to kill you." I had a plan. At this point, I pushed Noel out from behind the fridge. Noel started going back, and the man was walking forward, chuckling. As soon as he came near the distance of the fridge, I shot out and sprayed pepper spray in his eyes. He screamed in pain and then started swinging the screwdriver in his hand. I grabbed the screwdriver and picked up a pan laying there and hit him on the head. He blacked out. He was dressed in a smart suit and was clean-shaven. We called the police and later found out that he was a man who was being monitored because there were several complaints of stalking and threatening behavior. They also found many tools in a bag he left near the door that would dismember a body. Thankfully, this sicko didn't kill anyone. However, I'm now happy that Noel called me because I dread to think what would have happened if I wasn't there. This incident took place in Dubai when I was 10. I used to go to my friend's apartment to play with him at the time of vacation. One day, as usual, I went to his room to play. After playing for a long time, I went to the bathroom. While I was washing my face off and other things suddenly started to fall down. I was surprised. I thought maybe it was because of wind. But when I checked the surroundings, I found out there wasn't any window in the bathroom. I got out and told my friend the incident. He told me that there's a ghost in his room. I freaked out. At first, I didn't believe him. However, then next his mother and father explained the paranormal activities which had taken place there since they moved into that place. His father was making a burrito in the kitchen one day, and suddenly a call came for him. He kept the burrito on the stove and attended the call. After attending the call, when he came back, he was surprised to find out that the burrito was burning down in flames from the stove. But he said he was definitely sure that he hadn't turned on the stove yet. Another day, while his mother was cooking food, suddenly she felt as if someone was choking her by holding her throat from behind, and she fled out of the kitchen with a scream. The same day, while they were sleeping at night, they heard sounds from the bathroom. And when they checked it out, they found all the things, such as bottles of toilet cleaner and other things, had been scattered inside the bathroom. And that story made me suddenly freeze. This was the exact same incident which occurred to me. They had called some group of ghost hunters and did some sort of rituals and found out that 2 people had been murdered by someone. To know if this was true, they went to the flat owner, and he said just the same thing like the ghost hunters and apologized for giving them this room. They moved out the next day after my visit to their house. Well, to this day, I still wonder what would have happened to me if I had stayed there for some more time. My name is Max. I live in the center of the city now, but a few years back I lived in an old house on a somewhat sketchy street. But that doesn't mean I was poor. The house was ugly from outside, and it was built before World War II, but clean, warm, and cozy inside, although many people died in it there. I always believed in ghosts because of all the weird incidents that happened. Like one time, at night, me and my mom were sitting in a room. It was pitch black outside the room we sat in. Suddenly, we heard someone was tripping over, falling in the kitchen. We also heard things like plates fall down and shatter. But when we walked outside, nothing was there. Everything was in its place, and we were so scared about what was going on. A few years later, I had a dream. Me and my mom were walking down a path, and suddenly we stopped, and I heard a voice saying, "Bridge." I felt something knocking on my back 3 times, and I woke up scared. Nothing was there, so I didn't think of it that much and went back to sleep. However, after that night, this dream appeared again and again. The voice said various things that I don't remember, and one time it said something about my mom's death. It always ended with something knocking on my back 3 times. It was creepy. One time, me and my mom sat in a room and talked about ghosts, and I told her about what I'd been dreaming. Mom went silent for a second, and she confided in me that once she was sitting with a friend, and he said something not too nice to her, just for fun. She got angry and screamed, "Shut up," in a male voice, and she didn't remember that. When she described the voice, it reminded me that the voice sounded just like the voice in my dreams. In 2017, she passed away because of cancer. She died in the same room, in the same house where I got those nightmares. After that, I moved out to another place a few years ago. So I don't live in that house anymore. But I still believe in ghosts, that they exist, and they are real.
It was the spring of 2017. I was flying out to Chicago for a job interview. It was around 11 p.m., and I was sitting in my gate at the San Francisco International Airport. A storm was raging outside. Rain pouring down the windows as everyone was bundled up on the seats and keeping to themselves. I was just scanning the rows of people in seats sleeping, on laptops or phones, and wearing earbuds before I noticed this one guy. He was sitting in the farthest corner of the gate by the corridor, with no one else sitting around him. He was not on his phone or wearing headphones like everyone else. He has this huge, crooked grin plastered on his face, and he's staring directly at me. He looked pretty average in terms of looks and what he was wearing. But that grin was so creepy, it was beginning to make me shit bricks. Naturally, I turned away and pretended I hadn't seen him. But the fact that he was staring at me made me continuously turn to eye him back without realizing. Eventually, they called our gate and I boarded the plane. I took my seat in the business class right by the window and went on my phone, checking Instagram and texting friends. I did not see the creepy man boarding. An hour later, we were up in the sky. Sometime through the flight, I got up to use the bathroom, and as I was finishing up in there, someone knocked on the door. I called out, "Occupied," but the person continued knocking repeatedly and aggressively. As I was washing my hands, I ignored it, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. So I opened the door to make some ballsy remark, but froze when I saw who was in front of me. It was that guy from the airport, still with that creepy grin plastered on his face. Quickly, I pushed past him and walked to my seat, not glancing behind me. The rest of my flight went normal except for the fact that I couldn't get him off my mind. As soon as we landed in Chicago, I was the first to get my suitcase down from the overhead luggage, and the first off of that airplane. I called an Uber as I walked to the airport parking lot. It was 12 p.m. in Chicago. The Uber came and I drove to my hotel. And as I checked into my room, I realized something horrible. My wallet was missing. I don't know where I could have left it, so I called the airport and asked them to search the plane. They did so and got back to me a few hours later saying they found nothing. I drove back to the airport and spent the whole rest of the day searching and turning up nothing. My only theories were I had somehow left it at San Francisco, or it had been stolen. I was able to recover and spent 3 more days walletless in Chicago. But you know what? Here's the scary part. When I got back to San Francisco and drove to my house, I discovered something disturbing. My door was unlocked, and my entire house was trashed. Everything had been broken, and anything worth a slight amount of value had been taken. I checked my security footage and was able to identify the intruder as the grinning man from the airport who, sure enough, had my wallet and therefore my keys. I called the police, who found his fingerprints all over my house. The only scary thing was that the prints did not match anyone on record. The Creepy Stalker. On Saturday at 11:30 a.m., I invited my friend Sophia to come to my house, just a general hangout. She came to my house at 12:25 and everything was going normal when we was talking in my room. As we were hungry then, we decided to go out, so we bought some snacks and walked to the park, which is next to the shops. When we about to leave from the park and just walked across the road, I saw a white car. I thought it was passing by, but the car just slowed down next to me and one guy opened the window. He was almost 35 to 40-year-old Pakistani man. He asked me, "Are you okay?" with a perverted grin. Then he said to me, come here, I want to talk to you." And I said no, while looking at the back seat of the car to see if he has anyone with him that will harm us. But luckily, he didn't. The guy said, "Please, I want to talk to you," while he was licking his fingers and staring at me. Then he made such a nasty hand gesture. I felt very angry and disgusted. Sophia whispered to me, "Let's go, he's creep." As me and my friend walked away from the car and went to a different path, which is next to the shops, he followed us and parked next to me again. Then saying, "Why won't you speak to me? Come on, speak to me. Come here, please." Out of anger, I yelled and said, "Leave me alone, you weirdo." Then we saw him with a very evil and perverted smile. I grabbed Sophia's arm and ran inside the shop and hiding. I was calling my other friend Jahim and told him briefly what's going on. He kept saying, "Call the police," but I thought it would be alright. Few more minutes later, we left the shop and walked on the same path as that was the quickest way to go to my home. We thought everything was okay until she turned around and screamed, "He's following us!" There was the same white car. So scared. My legs were shaking as we ran, and while I was running, I told Jahim on the phone, "He's following us!" and then said, "Go to the spider park." It was a small park that no car can park as there was houses around and which was right next to my house. I shouted, "Sophia, hide!" She hid behind the wall while I was hiding another place. As a result, the guy was still following but couldn't find us. He was roaming around the area. When he disappeared, we went towards the park from a small gate and finally went back to my place. Once we arrived home, I told my family everything that happened and phoned the police, but the police didn't do anything about it. They just said, "We will use it as intel and update you, but we can't do anything right now," which made us feel so sad. However, the most scary thing came up next by Sophia, who reminded me suddenly about the incident I've told her a week ago. She said, "What if it is the same guy?" I said, "What do you mean?" Then she said, "You know, when you told me about the guy who knocked on your window while you was trying to sleep?" My mind froze. It was 3:00 a.m. in the morning. Luckily, I had curtains so he wouldn't see me, but I never forget the moment looking at the end of the curtain where the window was showing clearly and seeing a guy arm knocking on my window. I remember rubbing my eyes to make sure that I wasn't imaging some demons, but no matter how much I rubbed my eyes, the figure of the mysterious guy arm was still there. From that day on, I just stayed in my room feeling very scared for about 2 weeks. What if he was the same guy knocking on my window?
When I was 7, I had a really scary experience that I will never forget. I got up at 8 a.m., as usual, but as I stood up, I noticed something was different. It was very cold, and I felt like someone was watching me. When I turned to my sister's bed, she woke up, and I screamed. 2 heads hovered in the air, one of an older woman with long, dark hair and green eyes, the other of a bald older man with blue eyes. I screamed again and ran to my mother. I told her what happened and saw some man at the door. I can't recall what he looked like, but I screamed and hugged my mother when I saw him. I was crying at this point, and she looked at me as I pointed to the door, not explaining why. She instantly knew what I was upset about, and she spoke in the direction of the door. I don't know what she said. I was just too scared to listen, and all I wanted was to be somewhere else. Nothing like this happened to me again, until I was 13. I was coming from my friend's house and was really tired. I went to my room, turned the lights off, and went to bed. At 4 a.m., I suddenly woke up without a reason. When I looked at the door, I saw my mother looking at my sister. She had lifeless eyes, which reminded me of the incident that happened when I was 7 years old. The heads had the same lifeless eyes as my mother, except her eyes were red and just looked evil. I knew it wasn't my mom. I hid under the blanket, praying that the thing would just go away. When I looked up, it was still there. I prayed again. Then it vanished. I mean, literally vanished. I saw it with my own eyes. That thing grew fainter and fainter until I couldn't see it anymore. When it was gone, I ran to my parents and explained what happened. They believed me and said that if I couldn't go to sleep, I could watch TV or just stay up. I thanked them and went to the living room. Now, I'm 14, and I talked to my mother about the incident that happened 7 years ago. And when I told her what the heads looked like, she seemed very surprised and confused. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me that the description I gave perfectly matched that of my dead grandparents. I don't know if they were really my grandparents, or who that man on the door was.
My name is Tade, and this incident happened to me when I was 8 years old. As I was in elementary school, we were learning about the Victorian era in history, which I didn't give a crap about. My history teacher had a Victorian family tree and stuck it on the walls of the classroom. I didn't know why we had to look into somebody's family history. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. When I laughed at it, the history teacher glared at me in the most stern and terrifying way. His veins were poking out of his head, and his hand clenched into a fist and was shaking quiveringly. "What are you laughing at, boy?" he yelled. It was weird. I was too scared to reply, so I said, "Nothing." Later that night, when I went to bed, I struggled to get to sleep. I was tossing and turning. A few minutes later, I finally drifted off to sleep, but it didn't last a long time. I woke up an hour later. I was checking my phone to see that it had just passed midnight. Suddenly, I heard a group of people talking outside. I thought it was one of the neighbors, so I headed to my window. When I looked to see what was going on, my heart just dropped. There, in the middle of the garden, were parents who were beating their child with a wooden club. The parents and the kid were all wearing the Victorian-era style clothes. I was so confused why they were here, why they are beating their child, and why they wore such clothes out of place. Then, all of a sudden, the mother looked up at me. Her eyes glowed red, and she cackled loudly, which made me so terrified. Then she pointed at the sky with a finger that was so skinny, and the family faded away. I couldn't sleep at all the whole night, and I thought about the class that I took at school. From that day, I never made fun of any teachers again.
Hi, my name is Shay. Well, at least that's what everyone calls me. About 11 years ago, my mom, my big brother, and I moved from Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee. We were staying with my uncle and his wife and stepkids for a while until we got our own place. About a month later, we found an apartment to stay in. I had a bunch of teddy bears that I really liked between I was 12 going on 13. Well, when we finished to move our new house, I decorated my room really nice, and I set my teddy bears on my shelf above my bed. A week later, I noticed one of my teddy bears would always go missing, and I would find it under my brother's bed. I thought he was taking my teddy bear just to freak me out, but he really had no idea what I was talking about. It was kind of weird, so I decided to lock all my bears in my closet. They stayed in my closet for 2 days. Everything was fine. That's what I thought until the third day after has been started. The third day, I woke up on a Saturday and my closet door was cracked and my teddy bear was in the same place under my brother's bed. I knew something was wrong. After that, I immediately threw my teddy bears away after that. We stayed in that apartment for a year. After that, we moved. I'll never forget the day of the move. We found bones in the fireplace from a human. Now I'm 23, and I still remember that day, but I always think, what if I set up a video camera to see what was causing my teddy bears to do what they did?
My name is Sam. It was August of 2001. I was 15 and accompanying my dad to visit his friend's new house. My dad's friend, who we call Rick, just moved into this house a few weeks ago. My dad wanted to visit and ask about renovation and decorating the place, as it was pretty old. Well, I'm English, so that means my country is full of old houses, from like the 1500s. Rick had bought an antique castle thing in a forest. I know, pretty creepy, right? Anyway, we arrived and Rick and his wife invited us in. My dad and Rick soon went off to the garage to discuss what plans were for that room. I was left alone with Georgina, Rick's wife, and their newborn baby, Rick Jr. Georgina asked me to fetch some formula from the kitchen for little Ricky. Being the good 15-year-old boy, I agreed, even if the house was home to demons. I went into the kitchen and the first thing I noticed was a trap door in the corner. Me, being curious, I opened it. A terrible smell filled the kitchen. It smelled like horse manure mixed with puke. Suddenly, a pale hand with long fingers grabbed me. I swore and started hitting the hand. Another hand grabbed my other hand and tried to drag me down. I shouted for my dad. Suddenly, purple eyes appeared from the darkness of the trap door. They stared at me. My dad rushed in, and the hands disappeared. I had scratches on my arm, and so I ran them under some cold water. My dad asked me what had happened. I said there was some demon guy in the cellar. My dad and Rick grabbed flashlights and searched the basement. Nothing was there. We called the cops who searched the property, and of course, they found nothing. When I got home, I went straight to my computer. It turns out a man was shot in a hunting accident there, roughly around 1770. But trust me, those hands weren't of a man. Rick still lives there, and over the past 18 years, there have been countless sightings and weird stuff. I just hope whoever or whatever that thing is goes away. It happened just a few years ago. When I was hanging out at my cousin's apartment, there was a building in front of the living room window. That night, we were having so much fun and having a fun conversation. It was 7 p.m. and we noticed that there was an open curtain in the building just a few feet across from our apartment. I got up in my seat just to take a quick look at that window. I was just curious. Then I saw a woman. At first, I couldn't see her face because her hair was blocking it. Then I told this to my cousin. He was shocked about what I said. He told me to get his binoculars. Then he used them to look. Suddenly, he screamed in fear. I asked him why. He said, "What the heck is that?" Then I got the binoculars and then I looked. My heart was pounding so hard. I saw a dead woman. Her neck was bleeding. Her blood was dripping on her yellow dress and her body was hanging from the small chandelier. My cousin has military experience, and he got up the courage to go into that room. Before we went into that room, we told the guard what was there. So we had 2 guards following us, and I told the one guard to follow me to our room so he could see what was in that window, and he was shocked too. He was shocked. He radioed to his fellow guard that was with my cousin, and then we followed them to the next building. We also called the cops. When the police arrived, we struggled opening the door. When we got there, we all turned on the lights and everything in there was all messed up. We opened the bedroom and we saw the dead body hanging from the chandelier. 2 weeks later, the murderer was caught, and the police gave us a reward for helping to solve a case. However, to this day, I will always remember the horror we experienced. It's a scary paranormal story that happened to me in my sophomore year in college. It still gives me creeps and scares me to this day. It's a true story. Trust me. As New Year has just begun, I moved into the apartment. It's a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 bathrooms. Me and my housemate got our own rooms. Everything seemed nice and got along great for the first week. I would often wake up to sounds in the middle of the night coming from the kitchen, since my room was the closest to it. I always assumed it was my roommate having a late-night snack. After the second week, he told me that he was actually going to drop the university because he didn't feel so well physically and was kind of homesick. I was sad that he had to go, but I was a little excited thinking that I had the apartment to myself and wouldn't hear his midnight munchies. And that night, I woke up to noise from the kitchen again. I was a bit confused because I was the only one in the apartment. I was alone now. I then went to investigate and found a knife on the floor in the kitchen. I put it back in the drawer and went back to bed, thinking it might have fallen from the counter. A few nights passed and I didn't hear a sound, except for this night. I heard some sounds coming from my closet. It was about 3 a.m., and then I just felt a coldness around me, and my hair was standing up on my whole body when I woke up to see my closet. Suddenly, I saw a dark figure standing next to the closet. It looked like a Dementor from the Harry Potter movies, but it disappeared in a few seconds. I figured I was having a wild imagination. The next day, I felt tired from all my classes, so when nighttime fell, I knocked out in my bed. That night was the night I would never forget. I remember waking up to some noise coming from behind me. I woke up and I realized that I couldn't move. All I could move were my eyes. I was laying in bed in fear. My heart started to thump really hard. I felt a cold air behind me as I felt this person coming closer, but I couldn't hear any footsteps. That's when I realized the bed was shaking viciously, but it wasn't because of me. I tried to see at the corner of the room and I saw the dark figure from the other day. This time it had red eyes, like those of the devil. My heart sank when I saw it. Although I wasn't a strong believer in God until that moment, I closed my eyes and started to pray to God to help me. I started to remember my parents and friends. That's when I felt the figure stop. I just kept thinking of everything that made me happy and praying to God to help me. And finally, I felt the dark figure leave the room, retreating back to its corner. After 5 minutes, I was able to move my body. I decided to go sleep at my neighbor's apartment for the night as I ran away as fast as I could run. I eventually moved out of that apartment by the end of the month. And now I'm always wondering if those things are what made my housemate leave. Needless to say, I'm glad I moved out.
So I'm a nurse, and I was driving home from work one night. The roads were deserted, and it was freezing that night. I don't live far from work, maybe a couple of miles. I'm driving down a residential street around the corner from my house, and I see a man laying face down in the street. Once again, I'm a nurse, so my first thought was great. Gotta help this guy. I was coming off of a long shift, and falls happen all the time. As I slowed down the car, I suddenly realized what an idiot move it was. I'm a 100-pound woman and I don't carry a weapon. I thought I should do something to help this guy, so I called 911 as I drove past him and slowed to a stop at the end of the block. While I was stopped at the light, I explained to the dispatcher that there was a man in the road who might need assistance. All of a sudden, I hear a loud bang, bang from the driver's side window. I screamed and I looked over. A man was pounding on my window and jiggling the handle of my locked door. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that there was no man laying in the street anymore. Still on the phone with 911, I screamed, "I'm so scared," to the dispatcher and floored it through the red light. I quickly told him what had happened, and even though I was right by my house, he told me to keep driving. After a few minutes, I had calmed down and he told me to loop back around. I pulled over down the road from my house and I stayed in the car. I didn't see the man anywhere, so I got off the phone with the dispatcher, who told me he was sending a police car to cruise the area. As I gather up my things, I do a final scan of the area, and I see the man. He's walking with two other men. I hunched way down in my car until they were further down the road, then bolted into my house. I don't know if he had ill intent, but it freaks me the hell out that he wasn't alone. Just always, always lock your doors.
This story happened when I was in the 9th grade. I was going home after being at my friend's apartment. He's one of my good friends, so I often visited him. It was about 9 p.m. at night. Usually I went home at 5 or 6 when I visited him, but it was final exam week, so I went home later than usual to prepare for it together. He lives on the 15th floor. I took the freight elevator down because it was quicker than the passenger elevator. The elevator is kind of old, shaky, and not really well maintained. The fan isn't working, the walls are rusty, full of graffiti, and the light flickers, as you would expect from an old building's elevator. At the moment, there were 3 or 4 people with me going down to the lobby. The elevator went down normally. Then, suddenly, at the 9th floor, the door opened. I saw one of my other friends. Her name is Billy. She was playing, laughing with some kids who I assumed to be her friends. Then she looked at me and smiled. I stared at her for a moment, but I didn't reply to her because, well, we're not that close. Nothing came to mind to say. So the elevator closed back up and took me to the lobby. But soon, I realized that no one that was on the elevator with me seemed to notice those kids, despite the loud laughter they made. But once again, I didn't care about it, so I went back home and rested. The day after, I saw Villy again. Out of curiosity, I asked her, "Hey, why were you playing so late at night? Why didn't you stay at home?" She looked confused, as if I was asking her a random question. She then asked me, "Well, what do you mean? I didn't go anywhere yesterday. I was at my house." I was a bit confused, and I couldn't believe what she just said. She then asked me again, "Well, what was I wearing yesterday?" I answered, "You wore a white t-shirt, right?" I was hoping that she would say yes, but she said no. I felt my heart dropping. If it wasn't her that I saw last night, then who? A few days later, as usual, I was visiting my friend and went home late again. I waved goodbye to him as I was walking the corridor. One thing came to mind. How am I going to get down? Remembering those elevator things, I took the stairs. Well, I guess it wasn't a really good decision, but at least better than that scary elevator. I walked down the dark stairwell. Once in a while, I looked at the open part, and this time, I saw a shadow figure looking out from the balcony across. It seemed normal to me, probably a person looking down, so I kept on walking. Watching my step, I looked back up again, and suddenly, the shadow figure thing disappeared into nowhere in just a blink of an eye. I was so scared thinking about how the hell did that guy disappear that quickly? By jumping down the balcony? My steps went quicker, but to my astonishment, I saw the sign 8th floor, which means I saw that figure when I was on the 9th floor. That same floor that I witnessed the ghost Villy. Soon, I called my friend and told him about it. He was surprised and told me that a lot of people also said that the 9th floor is actually haunted. There was once a guy that died there, but was found rotting in his apartment room 3 days later.
Hi, I live in a city of Philippines. This incident happened to me a while ago, but it reminded me forever and ever. That day, I was staying outside for some schedule, and it was kind of late, so I thought that I have no choice but to take a jeepney, which is a public vehicle in the Philippines, to ride back home. The street was pretty quiet, as I saw one jeepney was going to pass through, so I waved my hand. And when I just entered a jeepney, my eye directly reached a woman besides the driver's seat. The woman looked asleep beside the driver, and for her head is resting at his shoulders, so I thought that woman was a girlfriend of the driver. I sat to behind side, and in my front view of my seat, there was an old man, so there were only 4 passengers during that time. The inside of jeepney was quiet. Nobody was talking, and I didn't any pay attention to others. And that was the most worst things happened. When the jeepney have traveled for a few meters more, then the old man who was in front of me suddenly asked the driver to stop the vehicle and dragged me outside. At the first time, I didn't recognize what was going on. Then I was just scared of his sudden behavior, so I shouted, "Stop it!" He had no replies for a few seconds. Then he replied, "Shh, trust me." Still confused, but I quickly followed what he said because I'm very nervous that time and don't know what should I do. My mind was almost blew up. I kept thinking, what if he was going to steal something kill me? What should I do? When we already have left the jeepney, he stared me and finally told me with calm voice that the girl who was beside the driver's seat was already dead. I could not believe what was he saying. Then he said again, I saw with my own eyes. Her lips and nails were already black, and her waist had an ice pick stabbed on it and full of blood. I was shocked. If I didn't follow that old man so I didn't get off, what would be the next? The old man left behind me and said again, "You should be careful next time." After that day, when I get on jeepney, I always pay attention abnormally.
Two weeks ago, I woke up in the morning to get ready for school, as usual. Because I live in a small village, there's no bus that drives to my school, so I always have to drive with my bike about 4 miles. As I didn't want to drive alone, a friend of mine would drive with me to school every day. One morning, me and my friend would meet up at our place. Driving to the place, I wasn't feeling well, and my friend was waiting when I got to the place. We drove along through the woods and made some jokes about what was going to happen at school today. As we were driving, I heard some sticks cracking, and I thought nothing about it. Seconds later, I heard it again, and again, and again, and again. I asked my friend if he heard that too. He said, "No, why?" 1 minute later, I heard it again, but louder. I asked my friend, "Did you hear that?" But he said no. And the second after that, I saw a tall-like figure running just on the right of me. My heart got frozen. I screamed in my head as I saw that face. Everything was in the wrong place. The nose was above the eyes. The mouth was wide open, and the eye sockets were empty. I instantly passed out. 1 hour later, I woke up in a hospital with my friend sitting to the right of me and my mom to the left. My friend said that I fainted and fell to the ground and I had broken my left leg. The day after that, I laid in my bed with pain because of the broken leg. I had to take strong painkillers. Later that day, I laid in my bed and tried to sleep. As I was slowly passing out, I heard scratching on my window. I looked, and then I saw the face of the figure. I froze instantly. The figure was just scratching with its long fingers on the window and smiled with a wide mouth. I blacked out again. I woke up in the morning with pain in my leg. I rolled to my left and took my painkillers. After that night, I never saw or heard anything of that figure again. I told my friend everything, and surprisingly, he said that he saw something like that in one of his dreams. I still don't know what that figure was and why my friend had a dream about that thing. I put down my blinds and shut my window at night. Always. Now we have a bus that brings us to school. I didn't tell my mom about this, and never will.
A few years ago, I took my family up to the cabins by the lake because I just won a big case against some drug dealer. In the middle of the night, my wife woke me up shaking my shoulder pretty hard. She told me that someone was banging on our door. I thought to myself, why would someone come to our cabin in the middle of the night? I got up to go check the door and my wife tried to hand me my bat, but I told her I wouldn't need it. The person kept knocking and I opened the door. It was a kid standing there. I asked him, "What are you doing here?" Then he started running. So I chased after him as my wife watched. He kept running in circles, then he tripped and I grabbed him and asked him, "Why are you knocking at our door in the middle of the night?" The boy said, "'Cause my uncles told me to." I asked, "What? Why?" The boy hesitated and looked me straight in my eyes and said, "To get you out of the house." Simultaneously, I hear my wife scream out my name in horror, and I hear footsteps running right behind me. I turn around and I see 4 hooded men running toward me. I reacted so quick that I ran over the kid. I see my wife and she ran off the porch ready to swing the bat, but I yelled at her to get back inside and called the cops. The guys were chasing me and were about 15 feet behind me. I made it inside the cabin, grabbed my cell phone, and I called the cops. When the police officers arrived, they noticed that those guys went through our car and stole some of my information. Who were those guys? And what would have happened if they would have caught me? I know the situation could have been worse. They could have went inside the cabin with my kids and my wife, but what did they want with me? After that night, we never went back to that cabin.